We're at Emerson Point today. We're at the Portavant Temple Mound. It's called Portavant Temple Mound after one of the owners of this homestead. The original aboriginal Indians who inhabited this area, we don't know who exactly they were. They were the Timucuan, Tocobaga, Calusa, whomever it might have been. Built these temple mounds. They were mound builders in general. They built temple mounds, middens, which were trash mounds, and also causeways, and then the burial mounds, of course, which is self-explanatory. Temple mounds obviously are where the high priest or the priest or whatever the caste of person lived who would have conducted their spiritual rituals. And that's what archaeologists have identified this, is that the largest temple mound in the Tampa Bay area. The aboriginal people, without exception, lived right on or very near water, whether it was a river, spring, in this case, the river, Manatee River is right behind us. The mouth of the Manatee is less than a mile this way, if that. You can see it pretty clearly from over there, and that leads out into the Gulf. The original Indians lived here from time immemorial. We don't know. Some archaeologists have dated this site at 800 AD, but there's a question mark, so we don't know how long it would have been. But all Aboriginal Indians, for the most part, disappeared after the Spanish incursions, which is an interesting point as well, because directly across here from those trees is the national DeSoto National Monument, which is where originally archaeologists determined DeSoto landed. It's later been determined that DeSoto landed about 5 miles upriver on private land. We don't know where that is. That's not public knowledge. Of course, the archaeologists and the state and federal people all know that, but that has been more recently and more conclusively identified as a DeSoto's landing spot, the first landing on this continent. Of course, he later moved on up into Tampa Bay. After that event, after those events, after the Spanish landed, basically through disease and war, mostly disease, wiped out the Indians. They weren't interested in wiping everybody out. They were interested in the gold that these people had, that they thought they had, that they never did have. But they also wanted to conquer this land for their country, their king, and they wanted to find riches without exception. All of them were adventurers, either bent on finding new territory and becoming wealthy from that, gold and becoming wealthy from that, natural resources and becoming wealthy from that, or proselytizing the Indians that were here, the natives that were here, converting any of those to Christianity. And the old Catholic way of conversion was either convert to Christ or we're going to kill you. Well, we know the Bible doesn't teach that, but that's the way the Spanish were. The English weren't much better, but the English were somewhat better. They were not as intransigent in their Catholicism or pedantic. Once that period occurred in the 16th century, Indians basically faded out in this area. Seminoles moved in, which were the Creeks. The Creeks, Seminoles, Miccosukee are all Creek Indians, basically different branches of Creek Indians, different branches of Indians that were in the southeastern United States, and blacks who had ran away from slavery back before slavery became illegal. So then, after the Indians were wiped out, this was a homestead. Behind us, behind the camera, was a series of homesteads right on top of this mound, which means this mound was probably much, much, much bigger 2,000 years ago. And archaeologists have determined that there were a series of buildings, layers of buildings on these mounds that were burnt down, covered up with more shell, built up, burnt down, covered up with more shell. So it was a series, hundreds of years of series. And we know from our Calusa explorations down south that it took hundreds of years to build some of these mounds. It was a long time. They didn't just roll out and a couple of days, they threw all this up like Caesar crossing the Rhine or something. It took a long time. These shells were all waste shells. This was their primary food source. So as they utilized this food source, the shells became either trash or building material. In this case, they were building material. There's a couple of guys that came before Robert Griffith, but in 1866, after serving his country, being captured by the feds, and serving time in a federal prison for being a prisoner of war, he was released in 1866, moved here, I'm not sure from where, I'm assuming South Carolina or Georgia, but he moved here, obviously to get away from it all. There was no reconstruction down here in that time. It was all, this was pioneer land. And he built himself a home on top of this mound and sold it. It was sold to other people. A guy named Portavant was a French captain, a steamship captain. He bought it from Griffith sometime in the late 19th century, and he sold it to some other people in the early 20th century. But the house was all maintained, and eventually the house just deteriorated and destroyed. However, there's a cistern that the Frenchmen built remaining, and there are the remains of the original 1866 fireplace built out of brick and coquina, which is astonishing. There's photographs on one of the kiosks up here of the original building. The actual fireplace is laying on the ground in like 3 different pieces, but it is actually there, and that is incredible. With all mound complexes, that's why they call them complexes, there's a series of mounds. There's mounds all over the place. These people lived on mounds to escape the swelter. The higher up you get, the more air you get, the less mosquitoes you get. So to say that people only lived on the bottom, at the bottom of these mounds, is inaccurate. They all lived on mounds. Some were spiritual mounds, some were temple mounds, some were, mounds where they did their spiritual sacrifices, whatever it is that they did. And those were placed on a higher mound. And we see that everywhere we go, Crystal River, Fort Walton, wherever. It's all over. It's consistent in that regard. However, there were causeways leading to and from, and there were other mounds, separate mounds, where people lived at. And again, you would have to either live on a stilt house, all of the Seminoles, or you would have to live on a mound that you built up, because you had to get away from not only the heat, but the mosquitoes and the danger that is inherent with just living right here. I mean, you could be flooded, you could be attacked by, this would have been a place of alligators, Florida panthers, bears, certainly snakes. So this would have been it would have been dangerous just to live on the bottom. They had to live elevated. The people that bought the place in early 1900s, 1910, I think it was, planted this row of royal palms. This leads from the river right there all the way up to the top of the mound, and so it was more or less a welcoming type thing, like an avenue of oaks. Of course, everything we see around here would have been gone during the time of the Indians. It would have it was barren. I mean, there would have been none of these trees, none of this other stuff. It would have been completely barren. They would have used it, deforested, as we see with everywhere else. They would have deforested every scrap of wood for building material and fuel. So they would have had to go far and wide to collect their wood and their fuel. So we're not going to go all the way through all the temple, the rest of the causeway complexes and the lesser complexes. We're going to assume that over 2,000 years, or even 500 or 600 years, that this would have been deteriorated to the point that it is. Then that it would have been much bigger. Again, just with the Crystal River and the ones we see in Volusia and the ones we've seen down south there, they would have been much bigger. But erosion, takes its toll. So we're going to look at. We're going to go out to the river. We're going to go through the avenue of royal palms, which were planted over 100 years ago, and then we're going to take a walk up to the top of the mound and see the chimney and the cistern, and where the actual house would have been. It was just, it's pretty phenomenal. So try not to shake too much. Okay, here we go. That's pretty cool. And as you can see, the Manatee River is right here. And everybody, I mean, not just the Indians, but until roads were built down here, had to live near the water. Water was transportation route, and water was life. I don't know enough about tides and tidal influences and salinity and all that sort of stuff to be able to say whether or not this water was drinkable or potable. But obviously, when you live near a river, you're also using the drinking water. And I would imagine that this water was drinkable. Again, I don't know how far the tides of the Gulf come up, how much is brackish, how much isn't, how far it would be, or if that even varies from river to river. I'm assuming that it might. But obviously you would have gotten your food and your water right here. I imagine this is pretty salty. The Gulf is just right out there, right on the tip of that little area there to the right. That is the tip of Manatee River, and around that bend is open Gulf. But you can see this is obviously, I mean, you just imagine this place with none of the houses or boats or any of that crap. It was just a beautiful, pristine, natural environment. It's just staggering to imagine, and it would have been incredible to see. Just incredible. Okay, we're trying to move too fast, but move quickly along back up to the top of the mound. Some of these oak trees are a couple of 100 years old. And we don't know for sure, but we assume there would have been a roughly 300-year period of uninhabitation. So this would have been an area that was not inhabited. We don't know that the Seminoles lived here. We do know, again, that the original Florida residents, the original Floridians, did live here. And just, if I can do this without jerking too much, there's pathways through here and through here and down over there that all lead to lesser mounds, for lack of a better term. It would have been the causeway, part of the causeway leading to this mound, and also would have been places where other people lived. I mean, this would have not, there wouldn't have been 20,000 people here, but if it was a temple mound, people from all over would have come. People who lived on the other side of the river would have come here. So it would have been an important center of activity. And it's a pretty decent height. I'm not sure how high, but I guess maybe 20 feet, but that's now. Back then it would have been huge. And when we say this is the biggest in Tampa Bay, we should quantify that by saying this is the biggest extant temple mound in Tampa Bay. We don't know. There might have been a lot more that got ruined by the subsequent residents. Okay, here's some original foundation concrete from the Griffith house. This is a picture of the Griffith house. His wife describes it as a tiny little house and very pretty one. Okay, so I was wrong before. This says that the Hortons added a room and indoor plumbing, so that is probably from the 30s, the 1930s, that they added that concrete. However, the chimney is original, and that is very neat. But even though it doesn't say it, we can assume that this concrete was from the addition. And here this is. We can see the distance from the bottom to the mouth, to the, I don't know, the flue, whatever they call it, where you would actually put the wood in, is about 2 feet or so or more. So this house would have been a, you know, cracker construction type of deal, where it would have been up on, like the floor, the bottom of the floor would have been there, so it would have been up, elevated. This is really interesting right here. We can see the coquina meshed with the brick. Brick would have been hard to come by, but brick would have been essential for a fireplace. And I think it's really interesting to note here that all the brick is covered in a moss. And it's really, I mean, it lends it a beauty for sure, but it definitely tells you an age as well. So here, at some point, I don't know what happened to this house, but at some point, or this, yeah, with the house, the chimney fell over after the house collapsed, or maybe the house collapsed years before and the chimney finally fell over. But it's in 3 pieces, and you can see from here's a good vantage point how thick it was. I mean, this was well constructed. This guy did his due diligence. He just didn't throw this up there. This was well done. And we can see right here, there's more or less a stucco sheen to it, which is usually deteriorated in a lot of what we see in coquina structures. Castillo de San Marcos comes to mind first of all. With that respect, is all the outside, the stucco part of it is all deteriorated. This is a rainwater cistern that Portavant built 30 years after the house was built. And that's pretty cool. And other than that, you just have, you know, typical phenomenally beautiful Florida flora and fauna everywhere. I mean, it's like you step back in a time machine at this place. Whew. Alright, so this boardwalk is here for accessibility, but it's also here to protect the artifacts, which I'm sure there are a lot. And this gives us a little timeline here. So a Cuban settled and farmed in 1814 on the north side of the Oyster River, which was today's Manatee River, possibly here, possibly on Sneed Island, but who knows. But definitely this Robert Griffith and his wife settled here, had children, later moved to southern Sarasota County. I'm assuming to be near her family. She was from Spanish Point, Osprey area. So they lived up here for 4 years. 20-some years later, this guy bought the place. Emerson in 1899 homesteaded 6 3/4 acres.